Florine, and to Leslie, and to Corina, and to all of you who've greatly come here. As I'm sure most of you know, this talk was originally supposed to be at the National Library, and it's had this change of venue, and that's been a very sobering experience for me to realize how present the prejudice toward and resistance to gay identity seems to be here. So you're all fighting an important fight. I serve on the board of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force in the United States, and we have some steep fights to fight there as well, and I'll talk a little bit about my perception of some of them. And my optimism and my hope that as things change in the US, they will be changing in the world. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That was in Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And in the course of the last 2 years, both the President of the United States and the Supreme Court have expressed support for gay marriage. And one of the defining questions of my life has been to understand how we got from there to here, and how something that was universally understood to be an illness came instead to be understood as an identity. The title of this talk is about identity, but it's the tension between identity and illness that I think defines the emergence of a gay rights movement abroad and here. It's a battle that's fought every day. When I was perhaps 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store in New York. And after we had gotten our shoes fitted, the salesman told us that we could each have a balloon to take home. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, will give you some evidence, I think, of a mother's influence and its limits. I started in some ways obliquely in my investigation of identity. About 20 years ago, my editors at the New York Times Magazine asked me to write a piece about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback by the assignment, because I had thought of deafness entirely as a disability. Those poor people, they couldn't hear. What on earth could we do for them? And so I was very surprised by the request. And then I went out into the deaf world, and I went to deaf clubs, and I went to the deaf theater, and I went to deaf political gatherings, and discovered that this was an intimate world united by the shared use of sign language. And while it wasn't my culture, and it wasn't a culture I wanted to run out and join, that it had a valid claim on cultural identity. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those parents by and large try to get their children to function in keeping with what they see as the normal world. That those children then often meet other deaf people only in adolescence or thereafter, when that experience comes as a great liberation to them. And I thought how similar that story was to the story of gay people, who are mostly born to straight parents, who mostly think that it would be better if their children were members of the mainstream world, and how those children, all of us, often discover gay identity in adolescence or thereafter, when it comes as a great liberation. Now, I was very struck while I was with the deaf people by how much beauty there was in their culture. And I remember going to a meeting of the National Association of the Deaf and walking into a room in which people were running toward each other with warm embraces, and sign language was flickering around the room as hundreds and hundreds of hands moved in rapid conversation. And I had a moment of wishing I were deaf, which is not to say that I had a moment of wishing I couldn't hear. I like my hearing, it's very useful to me. I I like to talk. But I felt as I stood in that room that there was a society there that was quite beautiful and that I was not part of. And I eventually came to understand that this must be how straight people might look at a gay culture. They wouldn't necessarily want to join it. They wouldn't want to become gay, but they might reach the point at which they could understand why for those of us who were gay, it was a valued, even a cherished identity that had enormous meaning and enormous force for us. And that was really a shocking moment for me. And I've since been interested by theoretical work that's been done quite recently in the deaf community and in the deaf university in the United States, which is about a theory called deaf gain. And it says there's hearing loss. Hearing loss is what you don't have. And then there's deaf gain, which is what you do have. And the idea is that there are experiences that deaf people can have that hearing people cannot have. And I would say again in parallel that there are experiences gay people can have that straight people cannot have, and that some of them are very beautiful and very valuable experiences. So I wrote my article about the deaf 20 years ago, and after I finished it, I sort of thought about these issues a bit. And then about 5 years later, a friend of my friend Leslie Hawkes had a daughter who was a dwarf and made a film which was about dwarfs and about bringing up dwarfs. And by fortunate happenstance, Leslie's DVD player was broken, and she came over for dinner and said, I have to watch this movie that my friend Lisa's made, would you watch it with me? Is your DVD player working? And I said, yes, absolutely. So we sat down to watch this movie, and I had no idea how my life was about to change. But as I watched the movie, I saw families asking over and over again this question, because most dwarf children are born to parents of average height. These parents saying, in effect, do I bring my child up to understand herself as just like everyone else, but a little bit shorter? Or do I help to construct some kind of dwarf identity? Do I immerse her in the world of the little people of America? Do I give her a sense of fierce pride in the ways in which she's different? And I thought, here it is again. Here it is again, a family that perceives itself to be normal with a child whom they perceive to be exceptional in some very profound way. And I hatched the idea that there are essentially two kinds of identities. There are what I've called vertical identities, because they're passed down generationally from parent to child. So your ethnicity is in general a vertical identity, your nationality, usually your language, frequently your religion. These are things you're likely to have in common with your parents. There are arguments that can be made that any of these identities can be difficult to live with, but there's no one doing research on how to make them go away. And then there are what I call horizontal identities. Horizontal identities because they're not from your parents and the generation before, but from your peer group. So being gay, being deaf, being a dwarf, being in many other categories that I looked at in my most recent book, all of those are horizontal identities that you learn from the peers around you. And I thought these horizontal identities have a great deal in common. There's a great deal that's true of all of these horizontal identities that is not true of all other ways of being. And as I looked at these identities, I also was very struck by the question of this fine distinction, which I had not previously thought about, which is the distinction between love and acceptance. Love is something that should ideally be there from the moment a child is born. That child's parents should love that child. And while we all know terrible stories of abuse and neglect, my experience is that most parents love their children, or at least try to love their children. But acceptance is something else. Acceptance for all parents is the recognition of your child as a separate person with separate priorities, with a separate way of being. And some parents are good at acceptance, and some parents are not very good at acceptance. Now, acceptance is something that has to exist at three levels. There's self-acceptance, there's family acceptance, and there's acceptance by the larger society. And I'm acutely aware, by the way, that I'm giving this talk in front of an organization called ACCEPT. So we're all right on the same page here, I think. Each of those different kinds of acceptance feeds the others. The existence of this organization will make it easier for some gay people who are first realizing that they're gay as kids to accept themselves. It will make it somewhat easier for the larger society to accept gay people. But it's obviously at an early stage in that process. I believe that family is often what mediates between the individual and the society, and that acceptance really is contingent a lot of the time on a coordinated sort of full frontal attack in which you learn to accept yourself, you encourage your family to accept you, and then you try to persuade the larger society to join in that ritual of acceptance. And I found, as I did the work I was doing, that accepting a child who is gay, and accepting a child who is deaf, and accepting a child who is transgender, or who is a dwarf, or who has autism, or who is in any of a variety of other categories I looked at, that it has a great deal in common. That process of acceptance, that intense process of recognizing someone for who they are, is a powerful one. Now, underlying it is what I think is one of the very central questions of parenthood. Parents have to do two things. Parents have to change their children. You give your child an education, you teach your child some values, you perhaps teach your child some manners if you're lucky. These are all things that a parent has to change. Not changing your children constitutes neglect. But parents need also to celebrate their children for who they are and to give them a positive self-image. And there are some things that parents know they need to change. And there are some things that parents know they need to accept. And there are a great many things that lie in a foggy middle. And you think, how much of this can be accepted? How much of it can be changed? How much of it should be celebrated? What is my approach going to be to these aspects of my child? When I tell that story about my mother and the pink balloon, it's really a story about my mother thinking that by getting me to take a different balloon, she could change the underlying fact that was in question. I was 6 years old. I thought for some reason we were talking about these pieces of rubber that floated on a string, and that was the be-all and end-all of it. But in fact, we were talking about something much more fundamental. And I found the efforts and the pressure I felt, not only from my parents, but from the society around me to change, I found it very difficult and very toxic much of the time. But I also, when I was little, had dyslexia, which is a learning disability. And my mother worked very closely with me on resolving my dyslexia. And it was largely resolved. When I entered school, my parents were told by my teachers that I would never learn to read or write. I've had many problems in life, and that is not one of them. And so I think the fact that there was the possibility of making that fundamental change led to the idea that anything that seemed somehow unsatisfactory could be changed. And the negotiation, in a way, of my childhood, and to some degree even my adulthood, is this constant pondering, what to change, what to keep the same. So over the years, I became, in a way, a student of adversity. And as I looked at adversity, I was always struck by the fact that there seem to be some people who are defeated by relatively minor challenges, and other people who, when faced with major challenges, seem to draw some kind of strength from them. There's a sort of popular wisdom that says that that has to do with finding meaning. And for a long time, I thought that meaning was out there, waiting to be found, that it was inherent in people's life experience and you needed only to be awake to it. But over time, I came to think otherwise. I came to think that whether the meaning existed was not actually a meaningful question, and that in fact, what people were doing was forging meaning. They were creating that meaning when it was not there before, and that their doing it was an act of determination. In fact, I found that finding meaning matters much less than seeking meaning. So one of the mothers I interviewed when I was writing my most recent book, which was about all of these families of children with horizontal identities, the mother of 2 children with very severe multiple disabilities. And she talked about the ways in which she had learned from bringing up these children, and how much joy she had found in motherhood, even of these children who seemed not what a mother would want. And she said, people always regale us with these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. And that idea of choice was very strong for me. What are those choices, and how do we make them? And it was my conclusion that we make those choices all through our lives. When I was in 2nd grade, which is to say 7 years old at school, Bobby Finkel had a birthday party and invited everyone in the class but me. My mother assumed that there had been a mistake, and so she called Mrs. Finkel, and Mrs. Finkel said that Bobby didn't like me and he didn't want me at his birthday party. And on the day of his birthday party, she took me out for a trip to the zoo and a hot fudge sundae, and tried to make it into a little celebration of our own. And I sometimes think it was that moment with Bobby Finkel's birthday when I really first understood I was different from the other kids, and they didn't like it very much. I certainly, at that point, didn't have the vocabulary to say what that difference was. I didn't know what it meant to be gay. I don't think I'd ever even heard the word. But I knew I was different, and I knew that it wasn't going to be so easy to endure. And the nature of the difficulty changed, but the difficulty itself persists. When I was 13, I was on a school bus that went from my house to school with lots of other kids. And one of the kids who was on the school bus came up with the nickname Percy, which he thought was a good nickname for the fact that I had a less than masculine demeanor. I had sort of funny glasses, and I was awkward, and I walked strangely, and I was very unathletic. And sometimes he and his cohort would chant that taunt the entire length of that school bus ride, which was 45 minutes in each direction. And I would sit there while they said, Percy, 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 over and over and over again. They eventually put a chaperone on the bus to see to it that this kind of thing didn't happen, and the taunting stopped. But I still got called faggot all the time at school, often within earshot of teachers who did absolutely nothing about it. The next year, our science teacher told us in the course of class that all gay men developed fecal incontinence because gay sex destroyed their anal sphincter. And everyone just sat and accepted these prejudiced, dark comments being given in the context of classroom teaching. I ended up graduating from high school without ever visiting the school cafeteria because I felt if I had gone, I would have sat with the girls and been laughed at for doing so, or sat with the boys and been laughed at for being the sort of boy who should sit with the girls. And I really struggled in those experiences. I had my friends, I had my circle at school, and I had some real successes. I had the lead part in the school play. I sang in our school choir, which rather curiously for the time toured Romania in 1980. So I made my way through, but I spent my time trying to avoid taunts from the guys who called me Percy when I could avoid them, and enduring those taunts when I couldn't. And I didn't understand then that avoidance and endurance might be the gateway to meaning. So I talked about the idea that you don't find but rather forge meaning. And after you forge meaning, your next obligation is to build a new identity which comes out of that meaning, to recognize your traumas as part of who you've come to be, and fold the worst events of your life into a narrative of triumph by evincing a better self in response to things that hurt. I found that the people who believed that having a disabled child had taught them something, had made them think more deeply, had given them a purposefulness in their lives that they wouldn't otherwise have had, those people actually seemed to me to be living rather good lives. And the people who saw no purpose in it and who felt that it had no real content were the ones who seemed to me to have lives that were destroyed by their experience. And I thought this forging meaning thing isn't just something you do for fun. This forging meaning thing is a means of survival. And I then came across a study, an interesting study that was done in which parents were interviewed when they first had children with a variety of disabilities, and they were rated as optimists or pessimists. And then the families were visited 2 years later. And the families in which the mothers had been rated as optimists, the children had made more progress in their skills than in the families in which the mothers had been rated as pessimists. So I feel, again, like this question of identity depends a great deal on a kind of disciplined optimism, the kind of disciplined optimism that in many ways lies behind the formation of a group such as ACCEPT, that belief and that hope that change is possible and can be achieved. As I did this work, I asked parents about their experience of meaning, and I was particularly taken with the remarks made to me by a woman. She was a very sweet-natured older woman, extremely bright. She had a daughter who was a dwarf. She had written 2 major books about dwarfism. It had come to be a defining experience in her life. And I said to her, what do you make of this whole experience? This is not a life you would have chosen. What do you think? And she said, if someone had said to me, Betty, how would you like to give birth to a lesbian dwarf? I would not have checked that box. She said, but she's Anna, and she's the cornerstone of our family. I'm sorry the road was so steep for her, but I'm glad she managed to climb it with grace. And since the time that I did the interview with Betty, Anna has actually found a girlfriend whom I believe she is now married, and they are living in Brooklyn, and she's in a relationship. And Betty, who has not been very well, she's older now and has various ailments, talked about the joy she felt in realizing this daughter who had these 2 stigmatized differences. She said she loves and is loved well, which is all that I had hoped for her. I came across these ideas over and over again in that work, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about other identities before returning to gay identity, which I know is the uniting theme that's brought us all here today. But I interviewed many, many other people and got many of them to tell me their stories. And there was one woman I interviewed who had been brutally raped when she was 16 years old, became pregnant through that rape. Her entire life was derailed. She had hoped to be a doctor. Instead of going to medical school, she stayed home with this baby that she hadn't wanted. It was a very, very difficult course of things. And I said to her, when I interviewed her, at which point she was 50, I said, do you think often about the man who raped you? And she said, I used to think about him with anger, but now only with pity. And I said, pity? I assumed she meant pity because he was so unevolved as to do this terrible thing. And she said, yes, she said, pity, because he has a beautiful daughter and 2 beautiful grandchildren, and he doesn't know that, and I do. So as it turns out, I'm the lucky one. And I thought how extraordinary it was to have been able to take an experience that was as agonizing as the one she'd been through, and to come to the point, many, many, many years later, but to come to the point of actually describing it as a lucky circumstance. And I thought about the tragic relationship that many people I know had had, and that I had had, to my own sexuality, and about the process through which that sense of tragedy is altered or changed. So some of your struggles are things that you're born to. Your gender, your sexuality, your race, your disability, and others are things that happen to you. Being a political prisoner, or a rape victim, or a survivor of a natural disaster. Assuming these woes, these difficulties, these things you've struggled with as identities is a way of locating a common experience. It allows you to draw strength from others who share this experience, and it allows you to give strength to others who share this experience. You discover, especially in this internet era, a world of community, a powerful world of community, and you substitute the word and for the word but. So you say, not I'm here, but I'm gay, but rather I am gay and I am here. So, forging meaning and building identity. Forging meaning and building identity. That became a sort of mantra for me, a thing I repeated over and over again to myself. Forging meaning is about changing yourself, and building identity is about changing the world that you live in. Those of us with stigmatized identities face this question on a daily basis. How much to change ourselves to conform to the demands of the world around us, and how much to struggle to change the world around us to be more accepting of our differences. Finding meaning and building identity does not make what was wrong right, but it can make what was wrong precious. So I went in January to Myanmar. I was there writing an article, and I was mostly interviewing ex-political prisoners. And when I interviewed them, I was very struck by the fact that they were much less embittered than I would have expected about the years they'd spent as prisoners. Many of them actually talked about it as a time when they had been able to engage in deep self-reflection and in which they'd grown tremendously. But they were also much less enthusiastic than I had anticipated they would be about the changes that were taking place in their political system. And I said to one of the leading human rights activists, Dr. Ma Thida, who spent many years in political prisoner, 5 of them in solitary confinement, who almost died in prison, and who's since written a best-selling book about those experiences, I said that I was surprised by both things. And she said, we Burmese are very good at demonstrating grace under pressure, but we also experience grievance under glamour. And the fact that some concessions have made does not blind us to everything that's wrong with this society, which we learn to understand so well from our prison cells. And I thought that was a very powerful statement, and it resonated with some of my own experiences during the late days of the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, that there was a kind of expectation from abroad that because things were changing, everyone was going to be dancing in the streets. And there was an understanding up close that there were still so many problems to consider and to resolve. So I thought when I listened to Ma Thida, you can forge meaning and build identity and still be mad as hell. I certainly was never raped, and I'd never served a prison sentence. But as a gay American, I've experienced my bits of prejudice and hatred, and the idea of forging meaning and building identity was one that came to me when I was older through my exposure to people who had had far worse privation than anything that I had ever known. And yet, when I was growing up, I hated identity politics. I thought it seemed to me like a way of pretending to celebrate things you actually regretted, and I saw nothing to celebrate in the ways in which I deviated from the mainstream. So I went to extraordinary lengths to try to be straight, because I thought that was the better way to be. At the time, there was something in rather obscure practice in the United States called sexual surrogacy therapy. And I read about it in a magazine, and I called an office in New York on West 47th Street, and I made appointments to go for this sexual surrogacy therapy, which was meant for people who had sexual difficulties, without admitting to them, or even fully admitting to myself, that the difficulty I had was not in sexual performance, but in who it was I wanted to have sexual performance with. And so I went once a week to this strange office, and I met with people I was encouraged to call doctors, who assigned what I was encouraged to call exercises, with women whom I was encouraged to call therapists, who were not exactly prostitutes, but who were also not exactly anything else. My particular favorite was a blonde woman from the American Deep South who eventually admitted to me that she was a necrophiliac, which is to say someone who has sex with corpses, and that she had taken this job after she got in trouble down at the morgue. I was pleased to think that my own sweaty, anxious body was close enough to a corpse to keep her going. And actually that experience was in some ways quite valuable. It helped me to overcome a lot of discomfort I'd had, and it paved the way for me to have later sexual relationships with women, some of whom I loved very much. Some of those relationships were themselves very happy, but I was at war with myself. And what I was doing was to dig wounds into my own psyche. And that process of not accepting and not accepting and not accepting who I was, who I loved, what I wanted, what I felt, it was such a poisonous, such a toxic way of doing things. So while in some ways I find the memory of that place on 47th Street entertaining, at another level I can almost not bear to think about it because it was the apotheosis of a kind of self-hatred that I had learned and found. I'm in Romania at the moment because I've written a book about depression, and my depression really set in when I was in my late 20s. I'd been through a number of difficult things. I had a relationship that I had been in for a long time that ended. My mother had died. I had moved from England, where I lived for a while, to New York, and I didn't have my life figured out in New York yet. There were all kinds of things that were wrong. But nonetheless, they began to escalate into this serious depression. I've been talking a lot since I got to Romania about the experience of depression. I'll give you just a brief synopsis, but for me, it was the feeling all the time of a complete lack of vitality, a lack of the energy needed to lead my own life. I would think to myself, oh, I should get up and take a shower, and I would think, right, but I'd have to get out of bed and walk across the room and turn on the light in the bathroom and turn on the water and stand underneath it and find the soap and get out and find a towel. And it just all sounded to me so difficult. It sounded like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in conversations about depression is that you know it's ridiculous even while you're in it. And you know that most people get up and take a shower and go out to face the day without any particular difficulty attached to it. And yet, when you're in it, it becomes overwhelming. And there then set in this intense anxiety, this feeling all the time, which was like the feeling you have if you slip or trip in that minute before, that second before you hit the ground, but drawn out week after week after week. And I felt so frightened, and I didn't know what I was frightened of, but I felt like I was going to explode with the anxiety. And I finally woke up one day feeling so scared and so overwhelmed that I couldn't move. And I thought, I really need help. And I looked at the telephone next to my bed, and I couldn't muster the will to reach out and pick it up. And finally, after 3 hours, the phone rang, and I managed to answer it. And it was my father. And I said to him, I need some help. I was not in a relationship at the time. I didn't know whether I ever would be. I didn't think I would have children. I didn't feel like I was ever going to work out any of the things that mattered to me. And I was ashamed at that age to be moving back into my father's house. It felt so terribly juvenile. And then I went through all of the rituals of treatment. I began psychotherapy. I took antidepressant medication. I emerged. I decided I was fine. I went off everything. I relapsed. I emerged, and I relapsed, and I emerged, and I relapsed, and I emerged, and I relapsed. Anyway, I eventually realized that this was a lifetime's project to manage this depression. Now, depression was not an identity that I'd sought, but I found that one's identity can arise from this strange fact of one's biology, and that acknowledging it as an identity was a powerful thing to do. And I started writing about it, writing first a magazine article that then led to the book that's been published here. I've had, I think, 14 interviews since I arrived in Romania 2 days ago about that book. And every single person I've talked to has said, wasn't it very difficult for you to be so public about your experience? And the answer, which I didn't give to everyone in the wake of the National Library being cancelled and so on, because I didn't know that people would relate to it, but my feeling was that I had been in a closet for a long time at an earlier part of my life, and I had hated being in a closet, and when I finally came out of that closet, I felt like I could be myself. And I thought, I'll be damned if I'm going to be back in another closet and have some other fundamental factor of myself that I'm trying to hide from people and from which I'm trying to distract people. I then went on to work on a book about depression, and I looked at the fact that actually the people who are trying to keep their depression secret are frequently the ones who suffer with it the most, because they are the most lonely, in the same way that for me, as perhaps for some of you, being in the closet as a gay person had been a very lonely experience. And then I began researching rates of depression in various communities. And I started looking particularly at depression among gay people, which is astronomically and terrifyingly high. And I thought, why should there be so much depression in the gay community? I'll read you a few statistics. In one study, researchers looked at middle-aged twins, one of whom was gay and one of whom was straight. Among the straight, about 4% had attempted suicide, and among the gay ones, 15% had attempted suicide. Another study did a random population sampling of almost 4,000 men between the ages of 17 and 39. 3.5% of heterosexuals had attempted suicide, and almost 20% of the people who had same-sex partners had attempted suicide. I've got pages and pages of these statistics. I won't read all of them to you. There was a study of 40,000 youth conducted in Minneapolis that showed that gay males were 7 times as likely as their counterparts to experience suicidal ideation. And I thought, what is going on that my people and the community I belong to has this high rate of suicide, this high rate of depression, this high rate of despair? And I thought, it's not anything that's organically linked to being attracted to people of the same gender as yourself. That's not where it comes from. It's something that's linked to the constant feeling of inadequacy that gets imposed on gay people. And I thought, if we recognize that depression is an epidemic, that despair is something which is undermining our society. The World Health Organization has said that there is more loss of useful life years to depression than to any other condition. That we need to address the root of that depression. And if one of the places where that depression runs the highest is in the gay community, we need to figure out why that's happening and change our society, not only because it's kind and humane, but also because it's in the economic and emotional interests of the mainstream not to have this large segment of the population mired in pain and depression and sadness. So I looked at that. I looked at how those things could change, and I looked at my own emergence from depression. And I thought, people said to me, oh, you've emerged from depression, now you're happy all the time. And I said, no. I said, I used to be really upset about having to take a shower, and really sad about needing to answer the telephone, and really overwhelmed by the idea of eating a sandwich. And now I'm sad about the prejudice there is against gay people in the world, and I'm sad about the annexation of Crimea, and I'm sad about personal relationships that have gone awry, and I'm sad about global warming. And I'm no longer feeling those ways about such insignificant and unimportant things. And I found when I came out of the depression, I thought, okay, I've seen this terrible darkness, and what is the way of forging meaning and building identity out of that particular darkness? It's to insist that every day that isn't marked with that depression has to be one of seeking for and clinging to joy and finding ways to lead a joyful life. And I used to think that meaning comes out of difficulty and that the nature of the difficulty was terribly important. And I came to think, as Ruth Schechter said in that opening comment, that building the meaning out of difficulty is a choice. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So I posit that oppression breeds the power to oppose it, and that I gradually understood that opposition as the cornerstone of identity. A group of people is oppressed, a rare few of them turn that oppression into a source of strength, and others benefit from that empowered few. Those who find worth in their subjugation have started the process of building identity, and identity is a safe harbor. I saw it over and over again. Now I should add the caution that I don't want to glamorize deprivation. It's not that I think that misery is such a wonderful thing. It's not that I think all straight people should have the experience of facing the prejudice gay people experience. It's not that I think if you only had cancer, you'd have a richer, deeper life. It's not any of those things. It's only to talk about the methods for getting through such things. And I think also, my last religious reference for this talk, but it's the Gnostic Gospel of St. Thomas. And I've often wished that that were canonical, because the phrase in it seems to me to counteract all of the religious objections to being direct about your sexuality. St. Thomas said, if you will bring out what is within you, then what is within you will save you. If you will not bring out what is within you will destroy you. I think that's a very good piece of advice. So identity politics, we all know, can be narcissistic. You have people who are celebrating a difference only because it's theirs. You have a sense that people are voting short-sightedly on single issues and so on and so forth. But properly understood and wisely practiced, identity politics should be not a smug label or a gold medal, but a revolution and a way to live better. So I would have had an easier life if I were straight, but I would not be me. And I now think that I like being me better than I like the idea of being someone else. Someone who, of course, I have neither the option of being, nor even the ability fully to imagine. But if you banish the dragons, you banish the heroes, and we become attached to the heroic strain in our own lives. I also, nonetheless, have sometimes wondered whether I could have ceased to hate that aspect of myself without gay pride and its great fiesta, of which this speech and this gathering is one manifestation. And I used to think that I would know myself to be mature when I could simply be gay without emphasis. But I've decided against that idea. A friend of mine who thought gay pride was getting a little carried away with itself suggested we organize Gay Humility Week. I said it was a great idea, but its time hadn't yet come. There's so much prejudice, and it will take so much of the opposite of prejudice to fill the void that prejudice has created and to overflow it. So the condition in the world. In 29 states in the United States, I could legally be fired or denied housing for being gay. We all know, I think, the Russian anti-propaganda law, which has led to gay people being beaten up in the streets. 27 African countries have passed anti-sodomy statutes. In Nigeria, you can be legally stoned to death, and lynchings have become commonplace. Zimbabwe, the president said that gay people are filth and has threatened to behead them all. And in Saudi Arabia recently, 2 men who were caught having sexual relations with each other were each sentenced to 7,000 lashes and are both permanently disabled. India's court, as we know, recently ruled that gay sex was illegal. So who can forge meaning and build identity in the face of all of that? And if it's hard to be gay, then what is it like to be trans? I'll tell you about 2 trans families I got to know. The first is a woman who was a teacher for children with disabilities and special needs in a town in Tennessee in the United States. One day a child came into her class who was unable to speak, and she checked to see where he'd come from and why he was in such terrible shape. He was almost 6 years old. And it turned out that he had a mother who had psychosis and who, instead of taking her medication, had been feeding it to her children to sedate them. And the children had just been taken away by social services. They had been kept tied to a pole in a room in her house. So Anne decided that she was going to work with this child and see what she could do about helping him. And she worked with him for a few months, and she got him to begin talking. And then she was told he would be removed from her class because he and his two brothers were being sent to 3 different homes because no one could be found who would take all 3 children. And she said, I'll take all 3 children. And so suddenly and on the spur of the moment, she adopted these 3 children with her husband, and they came to live with them. And over the next 5 years, she worked constantly with them to help them recover from the terrible abuse and neglect they had experienced as children. And after a while, the first one was diagnosed with hyperactivity, with ADHD, and he was given treatment for that. And the second one was diagnosed with juvenile bipolar disorder, or manic depression, and was given treatment for that. And the third one just seemed sad all the time. And finally one day, Anne was sitting with her youngest child, whose name was Carrie, and he said, Mom, can't you see that I'm a girl? Don't I have hands like a girl? Don't I sound like a girl? Don't you think I'm a girl? And she said, no, what are you talking about? And he said, life would be so much easier if I were a girl. Well, Anne went and she did her research, and she found out what it meant to be transgender. And she took her child, her youngest child, off to see a therapist in Nashville, which was the big city closest to her town. And the therapist said, yes, your child is transgender, and you really should at least make a go of letting her live as a girl. So she came home, and she said to Carrie, she said, finish out the school year as yourself, and when you finish school, we'll try for a week letting you live as a girl, and we'll see whether you really like it, and then we'll go from there. So Carrie finished out the school year, and then lived for a week as a girl, and changed his name to Kelly, and as soon as she began living as a girl, she became this joyful, exuberant child, and said the transformation was unlike anything she had ever imagined. She said she was overwhelmed by this energy, by the hugs and the snuggles, by the running back and forth, by the laughing, as soon as she was wearing girl's clothes and being called by a girl's name and being allowed to do girlish things. And Anne said she realized that she could never make her go back to living as a boy. So she went to the school where she had taught at that point for more than 20 years, where she had taught all of the disabled children in this town, all the special needs children. And she said, when Carrie comes back to school in the fall, he won't be a boy named Carrie, she'll be a girl named Kelly. And I just wanted to let you know so that you can be prepared. And she gave everyone a copy of a book about transgender children that she thought would help them. And by the time she got home, she said, the phone calls had begun. They were from people saying they would take that child and make her a girl if that's what she thought she was. They were from people threatening to kill Anne. They were from people threatening to kill the children. They were from people threatening to kidnap the children and bring them up right. And she was so shocked, she didn't know what to do. And so she slept that night in front of the door of the little house she lived in with a shotgun in her lap. And the next day, her pediatrician called her and said, the conversation around the swimming pool isn't about whether to kill your child. It's about when to do it and what to use to do it with. And if you want that child to stay alive, you'd better get her out of town pretty darn fast. So Anne went home, and she packed up a family van with everything she could fit in it. She got in the kids and most of the possessions she needed. She couldn't fit their dog, and she drove off to another city, and she's never returned to that town again. Because the day after she left, her husband, who stayed behind because they needed his income, went to work at the factory where he was employed. And when he came home, he found that their family dog had been disemboweled and nailed to the fence with the message that their child was next. When I talked to Anne about all of this, she was living in another town. She was cut off from what had come before, and this is what she said. I don't love my daughter less for mourning over this, but I miss my mom. I miss my sister. My daddy's grave is back there. and I just have to hope someone else is putting flowers on it. I miss my dog. I miss my students. I feel really guilty because I'm still hung up on all this stuff that we left behind. I should just let that go. But it makes me so angry that these people have taken our lives from us. But you can't grieve all the time when you've got your kids. You see how far they've come, and they reach you right in your heart. So regret? No. I miss the things that were in the old life. But if I knew this was going to happen, I would still adopt Kelly. Because honestly, if it weren't for Kelly, I wouldn't have met you and all of the other people I've met in this bigger, more beautiful world I've entered. I mean, if you just look at it, Kelly has brought more blessings into my life than I could possibly give back to her. So that's a story of a community that treated their trans child very cruelly. I also became very close to a trans woman named Kim Reed, who was in a small town called Helena, Montana, and who was the quarterback on her high school football team, and who transitioned and became a woman and never went home again to Helena, Montana, and finally returned for her father's funeral because she felt she couldn't miss that. And when she returned, found that she was accepted much more readily than she would ever have anticipated, and decided to make a film. And so she made a film about going to her 20th high school reunion and what it was like. My particular favorite moment in the film is when she's sitting and talking to someone from her class who says politely, "But Kim, we've all changed." The film was made, and the pastor in the church where she'd grown up said that he would like to have a special weekend when he showed the film on Friday, had seminars to discuss its contents on Saturday, and asked Kim to preach the sermon in church on Sunday. And so they did, and I want to read you a little excerpt from Kim's sermon. She said, "The night before last, when our film was playing in here, I went outside to the columbarium where my father's ashes rest. As I was kneeling there by what I call Dad's spot, I thought of the hours and hours of videotape that he shot lovingly of me during my football games, and how much of the same footage was now being shown inside this sanctuary because I'd used it in my film. Now, it's certainly not the context that any of us expected, but I knew Dad would be proud. And just then, the dusk breeze blew in, this waft of sound, and it was strangely familiar to me, and I realized it was the crosstown football game coming from the stadium. The band was playing, and the announcer was bellowing, and all of these old tapes were playing inside here on the screen, and I knew that new ones were being recorded to tape just a few blocks away. Those recording those new memories should be only so lucky as to be surprised by the last thing that they expected from their loved ones, only so fortunate as to get a chance to welcome them home with radical love. I thought about how all these cycles of lives would continue on, and so many aspects of my life coalesced in that one moment, that one beautiful, stunning, blessed moment. The past and the present, parent and child, male and female, the pain that life sometimes brings, and the soothing love that welcomes it with open arms after its journey into a distant country. I should emphasize that even in the United States, gay rights and trans rights are not primarily marriage rights, though marriage is what occurs in all of the newspaper headlines. Nonetheless, the advancement of marriage, and I know that the Civil Unions Bill was roundly defeated here in Romania just a few days ago, but I hope that will change. The advent of marriage rights has felt transformative, even if it's not the whole way forward. I met my husband John in 2001 when I was on tour for my depression book. An interview about depression in the American Midwest may not sound like the beginning of a great romance, but for us it was. He interviewed me for the paper in Minneapolis. And And in 2007, we decided to get married. I think that when I met John, it was both the discovery of great happiness and the end of a terrible unhappiness. And sometimes I was so occupied with the disappearance of that unhappiness and loneliness that I forgot to celebrate the happiness. And marriage was a way of indicating that the happiness was the central thing in our lives. So we then got into conversations about having a family. Now, I will explain my family in the most condensed way that I can. My husband, John, is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. One of my closest friends from college had gone through a difficult divorce but wanted to have children, and so she and I have a daughter, and mother and daughter live in Fort Worth, Texas. And then my husband and I wanted the experience of bringing up a child full-time, and so we have a son of whom I am the biological father. We had an egg donor, and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of his 2 biological children. So the short description is 5 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And people say to me, you did this radical political thing, and people have written a lot now about the family, and it has in a way become a radical political thing, but that wasn't how it was imagined. It was imagined as the realization of a lot of love that we all felt for one another. But I knew as we set out to make this family that having children was going to be a matter of new meanings and new identities, ours and theirs, and that we were going to have to be able to manage that we were going to have to figure out how to take care of our children. And I was very touched by something that was said by a sociologist who said, we not only care for our children because we love them, we also love them because we take care of them. And that process of taking care is immensely bonding. I didn't know when we started out what my relationship to my children would be like, and I don't think I understood what the strength of that bond was going to be. And I've discovered with these children that in any given instance, I would like to spare them from any form of pain or suffering. I would like to be able to protect them as much as possible. But I think the lesson I have from the experience of growing up as a gay person is that actually adversity is ultimately can be made strengthening. And while I would protect my children from any individual unhappiness, I feel like if I were to protect them from all unhappiness, not that I could, but if I could, that I would be cheating them. I'd be cheating them of what it is to be alive and cheating them of the knowledge that I was able to acquire as a gay parent. I often think about something that a Buddhist scholar said to me once. He said, Westerners mistakenly think that nirvana is a state that you arrive at when all your suffering is behind you and you have only happiness to look forward to. But he said, that would not be nirvana because your current happiness would always be shadowed by your past sadness. Nirvana is the state you arrive at when you not only have only happiness to look forward to, but also reimagine and re-understand all of your past experience and find in it the seedlings of your joy and recognize that that too is part of your happiness. I think then that the question is not whether I'm a better father because I got bullied when I was in school, that I was strangely grateful even to Bobby Finkel and being excluded from his birthday party, even to the kids who called me Percy, because I thought it was something in all of those experiences that had finally led me to this moment. Now, I subsequently had a conversation with my psychotherapist, being an American and depressive, like everyone else, I have a psychotherapist. And I said that to him, and I told him the whole story. It was very moving, and he said, it's very moving, he said, but actually, you're not glad you had those experiences. You're deeply wounded by them, and they're a permanent gash in your side. And I said, well, it's both. On the one hand, they are a gash in my side, and on the other hand, they did get me to this surprising present moment. So I think I should say that I'm wounded and also grateful for so much of what's happened in my life. The gay activist Harvey Milk was once asked, the great gay activist, one of the first real gay activists in America, was asked by a younger gay man, what can I do to help the movement? And Harvey Milk said, go out and tell someone. And it's that process of asserting who we are, a process that I know everyone in this room is in one way or another involved with, that actually is the thing that will bring about change and that will make a difference. If we tell our stories, and tell our stories repeatedly and audibly, it's very difficult for people to hate anyone whose story they truly know. If we live our lives out loud, we can trounce the hatred and we can expand everyone's lives. So forge meaning, build identity. Forge meaning, build identity, and then invite the world to share your